The air is thick with the acrid scent of smoke and gunpowder, as the sound of explosions and gunfire echoes through the streets of Bakhmut. Russian troops are launching a relentless assault on this Ukrainian city, storming house by house and inch by inch. Despite the valiant efforts of the Ukrainian military and their allies, the city is slowly but surely falling under Russian control. As the first anniversary of this tragic conflict approaches, the scenes in Bakhmut serve as a haunting reminder of the year-long war that has ravaged both sides. For the people of Ukraine, it has been a year of unrelenting misery and terror with no end in sight. But what is the root cause of this catastrophe? What ignited this conflict? And what continues to fuel it today? Many people mistakenly believe that this war is all about Ukraine's quest to join NATO. But the truth is much more complex and unsettling. Join us as we travel back in time to unravel the tangled web of events that led to this devastating war. A story of political ambition, covert agendas, and self-serving interests that has left a wake of misery and devastation in its path. Together, let us explore the reasons behind this heart-wrenching anniversary and seek to gain a deeper understanding of the truth behind this devastating conflict. The story begins in the early medieval period. Russia and Ukraine were initially united in the Kievan Rus. It was a state that emerged in the 9th century and lasted until the Mongols invaded the land in the 13th century. After the fall of the Kievan Rus, the region that is now Ukraine was ruled by a succession of different powers. It includes Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, Russia was gradually expanding its territory and becoming a dominant power in the region. Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia at the time, viewed Ukraine as a strategically important territory and sought to expand the Russian Empire's borders. In 1783, she declared the annexation of the Crimean Khanate. This region had been a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. She established a new province here called the Tauric Peninsula. Why did this happen? Because the Crimean Peninsula is strategically important to Russia for many reasons, and the major one is military benefits. Crimea is home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is based in the city of Sevastopol. The fleet is crucial to Russia's military and geopolitical interest in the Black Sea region. It is why Russia so badly wanted to take over Crimea. Other than this, having access to a warm water port is also important for Russia's economy and trade. These are the two major reasons the Russian government has always wanted to keep its control over the Crimean Peninsula. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 marked the beginning of Russia's expansion into Ukraine, which continued over the next few decades. However, Russians never got to keep Crimea to themselves for too long. After nearly 2 centuries, the region turned back under Ukrainian control. That's when things started to get heated again. So how did Ukraine get it back? You will find out the answer in a minute. A major historical event that steered the current relationship between Ukraine and Russia was the Soviet era. This era began in 1917, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Russian Provisional Government. They established the world's first communist state, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The Bolsheviks' victory in the Russian Civil War in 1922 ultimately led to the creation of the Soviet Union, which was made up of 15 republics. It included Ukraine and Russia, of course. During the Soviet era, the government imposed strict control over all aspects of life, including the economy, politics, and culture. Remember when we just said that Ukraine got Crimea back? So here's how. In 1954, the USSR transferred the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as a symbolic gesture on the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Treaty. After that, Crimea remained part of Ukraine even after the end of the Soviet Union. Now the question arises, why did this highly powerful union end? Despite some achievements, the Soviet system was marked by authoritarianism, repression, and the suppression of national identities. So it ultimately collapsed in 1991 due to economic, political, and social unrest. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia took a significant turn in this oppressive era. During this time, Ukraine was a republic within the Soviet Union. Still, the country's economy and culture were heavily influenced by Russia. There were periods of high tension between the two countries. Take the 1930s famine as an example. This horrifying famine is known as the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. It was a man-made tragedy that resulted from Soviet policies aimed at suppressing Ukrainian nationalism and controlling their agricultural production. At that time, Joseph Stalin was the political leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's government implemented collectivization and restricted the movement of food in and out of Ukraine. The government seized almost 5 million tons of harvest, which led to a severe famine that killed 8 million people in Ukraine. After this event, many Ukrainians started to see Russia as a historical aggressor that seeks to undermine their independence and territorial integrity. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine declared independence and became a sovereign state. The newly independent state faced many internal and external challenges in this transition. It had to create a new political system, adopt a new economic structure, and establish new diplomatic relations with other nations. There was one factor bigger than any of these, though. This one factor has played a major role in shaping the current state of Ukraine. It was a decision made over something seemingly trivial, which has had far-reaching and devastating consequences. It was Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear weapons. So, why did Ukraine do so? Why did it give up its weapons, and to whom? And how did it acquire them in the first place? Let's find out. The Soviet Union had approximately 45,000 nuclear weapons when it collapsed. So, one of the most significant issues at the time of its collapse was the fate of the Union's nuclear arsenal. Ultimately, the weapons were distributed among the newly independent states. Ukraine received its fair share and ended up being a possessor of the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world at the time. This independent state inherited around 1,900 nuclear warheads, 44 strategic bombers, and 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles. Ukraine initially declared its intent to keep the weapons. However, this decision immediately raised concerns among the international community, particularly the United States and Russia. They cannot afford to let Ukraine keep such a large number of nuclear weapons. It was because then their chance of staying on top of other countries around the world would have always been under threat with Ukraine having this much arsenal. In response to this concern, the United States and Russia signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in 1991, which aimed to reduce the number of nuclear warheads in the world. After that, in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum was presented in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. This memorandum was an agreement between these three countries and the world's most powerful nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. The memorandum prohibited these nuclear power nations from using military force against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. They would also prevent any possible threat or use of force against Ukraine's sovereignty and existing borders in exchange for Ukraine's commitment to give up its nuclear arsenal. In addition to the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom, France and China also played a role in supporting the Budapest Memorandum. While they did not sign the memorandum itself, they provided separate declarations in support of its objectives. The Budapest Memorandum ensured Ukraine its security and protection as a newly independent state. Ukraine saw the transfer of its nuclear arsenal as a way to ease tensions with Russia and other countries in the international community. So under the agreement, Ukraine agreed to transfer all of its nuclear weapons to Russia for dismantling. It ended up becoming a non-nuclear state. This decision ultimately left Ukraine vulnerable to Russian aggression, as it had given up a key deterrent against any potential threat from Russia. In February 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Ukrainian president at that time, was removed from office by the country's parliament following months of protests against him. People were not happy with his decision to keep the ties with Russia because he backed out of a proposed association agreement with the European Union. So, when he was removed from the seat of presidents, Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a new government was formed in Ukraine. In the same month, Russian forces appeared in Crimea, which was at that time a Ukrainian territory. The Russian forces first took over key locations, and then a so-called referendum was held on March 16, 2014 to ask the public if they wanted to join Russia or stay a part of Ukraine. Because this part of Ukraine had a predominantly ethnic Russian population, the majority of voters allegedly chose to join Russia. This referendum was an illegal and unconstitutional act because it was organized by pro-Russian separatists and held under the presence of Russian military forces in the region. The Ukrainian government did not recognize the referendum as legitimate The international community, including the United States and the European Union, also condemned the annexation of Crimea as a violation of international law. Russia was also accused of violating the Budapest Memorandum after the attack and illegal referendum. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning Russia's actions and reaffirming Ukraine's territorial integrity. Despite these condemnations, Russia continued to occupy Crimea and maintain its annexation of the peninsula, making it part of the Russian Federation. This move was seen as a clear violation of the international order and the principle of the inviolability of national borders. It was also a significant threat to the security and stability of the region. The annexation of Crimea was just the beginning of a series of events that led to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The events leading up to the attack on Ukraine were complex and multifaceted, but the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent conflict in eastern Ukraine played a crucial role in the deterioration of relations between Russia and Ukraine and in the eventual attack by Russians on Ukrainian territory. Following the annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine began an armed conflict with the Ukrainian government. The separatists were primarily active in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. These regions are collectively known as the Donbas region. These areas have historically had close ties to Russia and are home to a significant Russian-speaking population. That was the turning point when Ukraine decided to build its own army and join NATO. Russian troops were allegedly involved in the conflict, providing weapons, training, and support to the separatists. In response, the United States and the European Union imposed economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, including finance, energy, and defense, and restricted the travel and assets of certain individuals and entities. Russia, however, denied involvement in the conflict and claimed that the pro-Russian separatists were Ukrainian citizens who were fighting for their rights. Russia also accused the Ukrainian government of suppressing the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine and violating their rights. In September 2014, a ceasefire was agreed upon in Minsk, which aimed to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine. The ceasefire, however, was repeatedly violated, and the conflict continued. In early 2015, the pro-Russian separatists launched a major offensive, seizing the strategic town of Debaltseve and further violating the ceasefire agreements. In the following years, the conflict in eastern Ukraine continued, with both sides accusing the other of violating the ceasefire. Russia was accused of sending troops and weapons to the separatists, and the international community continued to impose economic sanctions on Russia. In November 2018, tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated again when Russian forces seized 3 Ukrainian naval vessels in the Kerch Strait, a narrow passage that separates Crimea from mainland Russia. The incident led to a naval standoff between Russia and Ukraine, and further increased tensions between the two countries. On February 24, 2022, Russian troops launched a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, marking a significant escalation of the ongoing conflict between the two countries. The attack was launched in multiple regions, including the Kyiv and Kharkiv regions. The Russian invasion began with a massive bombardment of Ukrainian military positions and civilian infrastructure, including homes, hospitals, and schools. They attacked from the northeast and south. Ukrainian military forces responded to the attack by mobilizing troops and sending them to the front lines. Within days of the initial attack, Russian forces had captured several key cities and towns. First, it was Kherson, and then Mariupol. Kherson was the first major city that was annexed by the Russian government. The residents lived under the brutal repression of the new authorities. They were subjected to widespread human rights violations, including torture and forced displacements, for 8 months until November 2022, when Russian troops withdrew from Kherson and Ukraine got back its regional capital. The scale and intensity of the attack quickly drew condemnation from the international community. The United States, the European Union, and other nations issued statements denouncing the invasion and calling for an immediate cessation of hostiles. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation and called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. As the fighting continued, reports emerged of widespread human rights violations by Russian forces. Ukrainian officials also accused Russian forces of deliberately targeting civilians and of using banned weapons, including cluster munitions and chemical agents. It was a nightmare that turned into a waking reality. The initial hours of the attack were filled with chaos and confusion, as the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed throughout the cities and towns of Ukraine. Families cowered in their homes, praying for safety as bombs rained down on their neighborhoods. People around the country were in panic. Many lost their homes and everything they owned, fleeing to makeshift shelters and refugee camps in search of safety and shelter. The death toll climbed rapidly, with thousands of casualties in both countries. Russia had many motivations to attack Ukraine with such brutal force. One of the primary reasons is access to the country's resources. Ukraine is rich in natural resources, including coal, iron ore, and lithium, which is used in making batteries for electric cars. The annexation of Crimea gave Russia control over the Black Sea gas and oil fields. At that time, there was an estimated 50.4 million tons of oil in the Black Sea that Russia got to extract, and around 495.7 billion cubic meters of natural gas. By seizing control of these resources, Russia strengthened its economy and reduced its reliance on imports. Now, Russia is the world's largest exporter of crude oil and natural gas, and a portion of its exported product comes from the Black Sea fields. Another motivation for Russia to attack Ukraine is its desire to maintain influence in the region. Ukraine has historically been an important part of Russia's sphere of influence, and the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of several independent states in the region. By attacking Ukraine, Russia may be trying to reassert its dominance in the region and prevents other former Soviet states from aligning with the West. There are also political factors that may have contributed to Russia's decision to take military action. In recent years, Russia has become increasingly isolated on the world stage, particularly as a result of its actions in Syria and Ukraine. By attacking Ukraine, Russia may be trying to demonstrate its strength and reassert itself as a major global power. Economically, Russia has been struggling in recent years, due in part to the impact of economic sanctions imposed by the United States and European Union following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. These sanctions have had a significant impact on Russia's economy, particularly on its energy and banking sectors. By attacking Ukraine, Russia may be trying to gain control of key economic resources that would help to alleviate the economic strain that it had been experiencing. Moreover, Ukraine is a major transit route for Russian gas exports to Europe, and controlling the country would give Russia greater leverage in negotiations over energy prices. In the aftermath of the Russian attack on Ukraine, the international response has been a mix of condemnation, sanctions, and promises of support. Many countries have condemned Russia's actions and called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. They also promised to provide Ukraine with military aid, including weapons and other forms of assistance, but the aid has been slow to arrive. Ukraine has been critical of the international response, particularly from the United States and European Union, which it feels has not done enough to support its efforts to resist Russian advancement in its major cities. Several countries have already provided military aid to Russia, including the United States and Canada. The United States has sent a range of defensive weapons, including over 32,000 anti-tank missiles, 561,000 ammunition, 700 Switchblade unmanned aerial systems, over 200 armored vehicles, and over 26 million small arms ammunition, as well as military advisors and trainers to help Ukrainian forces improve their capabilities. Canada has also provided over $1 billion of military assistance aid, including battle tanks and armored vehicles, as well as non-lethal aid such as medical supplies and winter clothing. Recently, Canada has also announced to send another $500 million to Ukraine as military aid. The International Monetary Fund has also approved a series of loans to Ukraine, totaling $2.7 billion to date. Other than these, Japan and Australia have also pledged financial aid to support Ukraine's efforts. Aside from all this military and financial aid, Ukraine requested countries to send Leopard 2 tanks. The tanks would provide a significant advantage in pushing back Russian forces and taking back control of Ukrainian territory. However, despite promises of help from Germany, there have been delays in the delivery of these tanks. Why? Because first and foremost, there is a limited supply of modern heavy tanks available in Europe, and Germany is the primary producer of these tanks. Germany holds the right to decide which country gets these tanks, even if countries like Poland have a supply of Leopard 2 tanks and are willing to send them to Ukraine. They cannot because they do not have permission from Germany to re-export these tanks. There has been a significant diplomatic challenge involved in the process of approving export licenses for tanks. In order for Germany to approve the licenses, it must have to consider the views of other European countries and have the potential impact on relations with Russia. Despite the delays, the delivery of battle tanks to Ukraine remains a high priority for the country and its allies. Luckily, just a few days ago, in the last week of January, Germany gave the green light and claimed that it would not stand in the way if Poland wanted to export the tanks to Ukraine. These tanks are expected to arrive soon in the Ukrainian military. As you now know, major countries are helping Ukraine fight this terrorizing fight. Still, many other countries have been hesitant to intervene directly in the conflict. This is partly due to concerns over the potential for escalation, as a direct confrontation with Russia could lead to a larger regional conflict or even a global one. Moreover, many countries that share a border with Russia may be reluctant to get involved in a conflict so that it does not directly threaten their own national security interest. Some are also hesitant to take action due to economic or diplomatic ties with Russia. The ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia has taken a toll on both sides. Recently, an imposition of export controls has been announced for Russia, and it has led to a gradual reduction in the supply of materials that could be used to rebuild its war machine. This may be the ray of hope that Russia will stop trying to seize Ukrainian land. At the same time, European Union countries are said to be working towards imposing new sanctions against Russia, since it is almost the one-year anniversary of the invasion. So, now that we have covered everything about the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the root causes behind the terrible war going on between these countries, let's do a quick recap of the key points. Russia's attack on Ukraine began in 2014, following the ousting of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. Since then, the conflict has escalated, with both sides accusing each other and increasing aggression on the battlefield. The conflict took a major turn when Russia openly attacked Ukraine's major countries last year on February 24th. This conflict has had a significant impact on the region, with thousands of lives lost, families displaced, and infrastructure destroyed. The world has been watching closely, with some countries providing military and financial aid to Ukraine, while others impose sanctions on Russia. There are differing opinions on the reasons behind Russia's attack on Ukraine. Some believe it was a strategic move to maintain control over Ukraine and seize its natural resources, while others see it as an attempt to expand Russia's territorial reach. Regardless of the reasons, the conflict has brought immense suffering to the people of Ukraine and has been a major destabilizing factor in the region. The hope is that a peaceful resolution can be reached, one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and the basic rights of all those involved. Overall, it is a complicated and ongoing situation with no easy solutions, but it is important to stay informed and continue to support those affected by the conflict.